What if the Civil War never ended, just changed its uniform, buried its guns, and bled into everything around you? Not a metaphor, not a theory. A war, unfinished, rebranded, and burning beneath your feet like a fault line no one wants to name. You think 1865 was a conclusion? It was a pause, a smirk, a regroup. While the nation toasted peace, something darker took root, in laws, in symbols, in silence. The Confederacy didn't vanish. It metastasized. It etched itself into courthouses and classrooms, ballots and borders. It rode shotgun through lynchings and riots, whispered through campaign speeches, and raised its flag inside the U.S. Capitol again. Every map line, every protest, every voter purge and gun rally and bloodied street corner, echoes of a war pretending to be history. You were told the Civil War was over. That's the lie. The truth? It's still firing shots in textbooks, algorithms, and legislatures. Still marching in boots, in slogans, in laws. Still killing in shadows. And the question no one dares ask: if the war never ended, who really won? Keep reading. But know this: once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. And nothing will look the same again. The wind cut through Appomattox like a blade that April morning, sharp, bitter, and unforgiving. It didn't howl. It waited, quiet, suspended, as if the land itself was holding its breath. April 9th, 1865, a Sunday. The war was supposed to end that day, but something in the silence whispered that it wouldn't. Not really. Not ever. General Robert E. Lee stood in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house, his back straight, his uniform impeccable, sword at his side, polished boots gleaming. He looked like a man carved out of duty, stripped of hope, but not pride. Across from him, Ulysses S. Grant arrived in a mud-stained coat, eyes tired, face hard. No grand speeches, no applause, just two men, bound by blood and history, doing what war demands of its survivors, finishing what thousands had died to end. They sat, they signed, the ink dried. That's what the history books say. But outside, in the fields where corpses still sank into the earth, Union soldiers didn't cheer. Confederate men didn't weep. No one shouted victory. No one whispered peace. They just stood, boots in the dirt, rifles slung across shoulders, watching each other like animals too exhausted to kill, but too wild to ever trust. The war, they said, was over. But under that quiet, something cracked. Not in the walls, not in the ground. In the hearts of men who refused to accept what they'd lost. Inside McLean's house, the air hung thick with things unsaid. Lee's signature wasn't surrender, it was delay. His eyes did not speak of defeat. They spoke of memory, of waiting, of preservation. He was already building the myth of the noble Confederate, dignified, wronged, never truly beaten. And Grant, sensing it, kept his terms generous. Let them keep their horses. Let them go home with dignity. He believed mercy would close the wound. But it didn't. It fed it. Outside, a few men began to shake hands. One Union soldier offered hardtack to a hungry rebel. Another gave tobacco. Laughter flickered, awkward, strained, the kind of laughter that covers fear. They wanted to believe it was over. They needed to believe. But belief is fragile when built atop graves. 2 streets away, someone fired a gun in the air. No one knew why. A joke? A mistake? A warning? Every head snapped around. Fingers twitched toward triggers. And for a split second, the battlefield almost reawakened. Because the war had taught them one thing above all: trust nothing that bleeds. In Washington, Lincoln waited for news. It came by telegram. Lee had surrendered. The president read it in silence. Folded it. His hands trembled slightly, but his face did not change. No smile. No joy. Only something close to relief, but buried beneath it, worry. He had won a war, but could not yet see the peace. That night, bells rang across the North. Cities lit up. Crowds sang in the streets. But Lincoln didn't celebrate. He walked through the White House like a ghost, already sensing his time was short. Because he knew, what ended on paper at Appomattox hadn't ended in spirit. The real war, the harder war, had only just begun. For days later, he addressed the nation from the White House balcony. April 11th, his last speech. He didn't talk about revenge. He spoke of reconciliation, of black suffrage, of Louisiana's reconstructed government. A soft voice, steady, But those words struck like thunder to the men who believed the South had not been defeated, only betrayed. In the crowd, John Wilkes Booth listened. The actor, the sympathizer, the white supremacist. He clenched his jaw as Lincoln mentioned giving the vote to the very intelligent black man. It was too much. Booth turned to a friend and hissed, "That means in citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever make." 3 nights later, the theater smelled of sweat and cheap cologne. Lincoln sat with his wife, watching Our American Cousin, a comedy. He laughed once. Then the shot rang out. Booth jumped to the stage and vanished. Panic swallowed the room. Blood soaked Lincoln's collar. His breathing slowed. He would not wake. And just like that, the fragile bridge between war and healing collapsed. April 15th. Lincoln dead. His body cold. The Union victorious, but leaderless. And in the South, word spread fast. The tyrant had fallen. Some wept. Others smiled. Grant said later that Lincoln's assassination was the worst thing that could have happened to the country, because with him died the only man who could have made peace stick. The only man strong enough to forgive without weakness. The only man who believed the South could be redeemed. What came next was not peace. It was punishment, confusion, and betrayal. And from that broken place, the lie began to form. The South didn't lose, it was cheated. The Confederacy wasn't crushed, it was martyred. Men who had once burned the Constitution now claimed to defend it. Those who owned slaves now called themselves victims of tyranny. Women dressed in black for generals who died defending human bondage. Monuments rose. Songs were sung. Flags waved, not in mourning, but in defiance. The illusion was complete. Appomattox was not an end. It was a curtain drawn over a stage still lit. The real play, the battle for memory, for meaning, for the soul of the country, was only beginning. Guns were lowered, but minds were not changed. Hearts stayed poisoned. Eyes stayed watchful. Hands stayed close to powder. And beneath every quiet southern town, every northern courthouse, every school, every battlefield turned park, something moved. Slow, steady, refusing to sleep. A war does not die when the last shot is fired. It dies when its ghosts stop walking. And in America, they never did. The house burned slow. It didn't rage. It crept. Smoke curled out of the cracks in the roof like a whisper choking on its own hate. Wood hissed as it blistered, heat peeling the paint from the porch like dead skin. Somewhere inside, a cradle tipped over, empty. A Bible turned to ash. No one screamed. They'd already run, barefoot into the dark, into the trees, into silence. A family of freed people, barely months into freedom, now hunted like shadows. It was 1867, South Carolina. The war was over, they said, but the night said otherwise. This wasn't war with cannons. This was war in masks. From the ashes of surrender, something foul had slithered back into the world. It wore no uniform. It answered to no general. But it had orders: silence them, scare them, erase them. They called it Reconstruction. The United States tried to stitch itself back together with trembling hands. Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act in 1866, then the 14th Amendment. A new America was being written in blood and ink. And for a flickering moment, it seemed possible. Men who had once been property stood in courthouses, holding office. Black senators, black sheriffs, black school teachers, ballots replacing chains. The Freedmen's Bureau opened schools, clinics, and labor contracts. Former slaves wrote their names for the first time, shaky handwriting, eyes bright, hearts terrified. They weren't asking for revenge, just a chance to breathe. But the South didn't want to breathe the same air. To the men who had lost their war, Reconstruction wasn't rebuilding, it was occupation, humiliation, a punishment written into law by Northern radicals and enforced at bayonet point by black soldiers in blue coats. They didn't see a republic being reborn. They saw a world turned upside down. So they prepared, quietly, viciously. White hoods began to appear at night. Not armies, phantoms. They knocked on doors, burned churches, strung up men from trees under moonlight. They carved terror into fences, fields, and flesh. The Ku Klux Klan was born in Tennessee in 1865. By 1868, it had metastasized like a sickness: Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas. Not a fringe, a movement. And the violence wasn't random. It was surgical. A freedman registers to vote. They burn his house. A black legislator speaks in court. They gut his horse and leave it on his porch. A teacher from the north tries to open a school. They set fire to her bedroom with her still inside. In the quiet towns, whispers spread faster than law. Don't go out after sundown. Don't look them in the eye. Don't talk about what you saw. The sheriffs were either silent, complicit, or missing altogether. And sometimes, they were the hooded men. In Louisiana, 1868, they left a list nailed to a church door. Names of freedmen. Crosses drawn beside each one. You've been warned, it read. 2 weeks later, 6 of those men were found floating face down in a bayou. Ropes around their necks, ears cut off. In Georgia, 1869, a black man named Abram Colby, once a state legislator, was taken from his bed by 3 white men and beaten for hours. They tore muscle from bone. They let him live. Barely. Why did you let them do that to you? Someone asked him. He whispered, because I wouldn't sell out my people. And the North, so loud during the war, grew quieter by the day. Tired. Distracted. The will to protect was waning. And the South knew it. Radical Reconstruction, they called it. Bold laws, military districts, federal powers stomping out the old ways. But laws are just ink. Power, once withdrawn, leaves a vacuum. And the men who had lost their empire were learning to rebuild it without secession, without guns. They had a new strategy now. Win back control from inside the system they claimed to hate. Force black voters away from the polls. Terrorize Republicans. Rig courts. Control the press. Make the states bleed Lincoln's vision from their laws until all that remained was the husk of a broken promise. In Mississippi, black voter turnout dropped by 30% in 1 year. Not because they stopped believing, but because they were being killed. Wagons carried coffins, not ballots. Some tried to fight back. Union leagues formed. Black militias defending homes, schools, churches. They trained at night, their rifles old and their resolve young. Some survived. Many didn't. Because this wasn't just about racism. It was about power. And power, once lost, doesn't die peacefully. Every firebombed house, every lynched body, every whisper that echoed down a hallway at midnight, it all carried the same message. Know your place. And the tragedy was this. For a brief, burning moment, black Americans had believed there was no place they didn't belong. They had tasted liberty. They had stood in sunlight, unshackled. But freedom without protection is just a target. And in the blood-soaked South of Reconstruction, the targets were everywhere. In the shadows, the war raged on. No drums, no bugles, no flags, only torches, footsteps, silence, and eyes, dozens of them, watching from behind cotton fields and broken fences, waiting for the next strike, waiting to remind America that old ghosts don't rest. They reload. The floorboards creaked under his boots, slow and steady, like a warning. Outside, the sun burned low, blood orange behind the trees. Inside the courthouse, the air was still, thick with dust and sweat and something heavier. Fear didn't move loud in these rooms. It sat in the corner, watching. November 1874. Eufaula, Alabama. The polls had closed hours ago. The votes hadn't been counted. They didn't need to be. White men had ridden in on horseback at noon. Not soldiers, not police, just men with shotguns, pistols, and a message: no more black rule. They marched straight into the heart of Reconstruction democracy and tore it apart with lead. Over 30 black voters shot dead in broad daylight. Their names never entered the record. Their ballots never entered the box. Their blood soaked the ground outside the polling place like ink bleeding through paper. And still, the North called it Election Day. This was redemption, not salvation, not mercy, the South's revenge. From Mississippi to South Carolina, they called themselves redeemers, as if they had risen from some holy pit to reclaim what had always been theirs. They weren't hiding anymore. The hoods were optional now. The violence didn't need shadows. They had learned how to win without war, by breaking laws faster than Washington could write them. The Reconstruction governments began to fall like bricks in a storm. One by one, state houses emptied of black legislators. Some were arrested. Some were chased out by mobs. Others simply vanished, never seen again. No charges. No justice. Louisiana, 1877. The streets of New Orleans boiled under the weight of boots and rifle barrels. White League paramilitaries stormed the state house, dragged out the Republican governor, and installed their own man in his seat. The federal troops stood by. They had orders to keep the peace, not to choose sides. But peace had a smell now, gunpowder and ash. By the end of the decade, Southern states had bled Reconstruction out through the skin. Election boards rigged. Black jurors removed. Black schools defunded. Freedmen turned away from polling places with guns in their backs and laws at their throats. They called it home rule. Said it with pride. Said it with spittle on their teeth. But it meant one thing. The Confederacy had changed its flag, not its face. The planters came back. Not in gray uniforms, but in suits. Not with bayonets, but with ballots, judges, sheriffs, and laws written like whips. They returned to their porches and called it honor. They wrote editorials about Negro incompetence. They spoke of law and order as they erased every protection written after 1865. The black codes were reborn, this time hidden inside constitutions and contracts. Vagrancy laws, convict leasing, debt peonage. Slavery didn't end. It adapted. And the North? It looked away. The federal government, once defiant, now whispered of reconciliation. They wanted unity, not justice. Peace, not fairness. And they were tired. Tired of death, tired of division, tired of fighting for people they'd never meet in counties they couldn't find on a map. So they made a deal. The compromise. Hayes would become president if he pulled the last troops out of the South. They packed up their tents, folded their flags, left black citizens surrounded by men who'd promised to finish what Fort Sumter had started. It was quiet at first. No parades, no speeches, just silence, cold and sharp as a blade. And then everything changed. Courthouses once defended by federal troops now hosted show trials. Sheriffs who'd once guarded black voters now stood beside their murderers. Men who had fought for the Union now sat beside ex-Confederates at dinner parties, sharing bourbon and stories, as if nothing had happened. They called it healing, but the ground knew better. The earth still held bones. The cotton still grew red in places where fields became graves. And in the towns where black men once cast ballots and passed laws, their children were told to step off the sidewalk when white folks pass. Old flags were folded away, but new flags rose. White flags, not of surrender, but of conquest. Flags of silence. Flags of complicity. The war had ended, and the cause had lost. But now, in state after state, courthouse after courthouse, that same cause sat grinning behind a judge's bench. It shook hands with senators. It rewrote history books. It called itself American again. The line between justice and survival blurred. Black families packed and fled north. Some stayed. Some resisted. Most endured. Because the new rules weren't printed. They were understood. Don't raise your voice. Don't raise your head. Don't vote. Don't win. And if you do, expect fire. In North Carolina, they passed laws so subtle they looked like bureaucracy. In Georgia, they redrew district lines like scalpels. In Florida, they priced the vote out of reach. And it worked. By 1890, black representation across the South had been gutted. Entire counties where freedmen once held power now elected white supremacists uncontested. The old Confederacy hadn't been restored. It had evolved. And the worst part, the sickest part, was that the North approved. They printed editorials praising Southern stability. Businessmen from New York invested in Southern railroads. Northern politicians praised the wisdom of letting local customs decide their own affairs. No one said the word abandonment, but the silence was loud enough. Every torch, every noose, every courthouse turned into a theater of injustice, watched and ignored, because Reconstruction didn't collapse. It was pushed, because freedom wasn't lost. It was sold, and the war, the real war, never stopped. The train screeched as it pulled into the station. New Orleans, June 7th, 1892. A man stepped aboard with calm in his eyes and fire in his chest. Homer Plessy, light-skinned, dressed well, a ticket in his hand. First class, whites only. He took his seat. He didn't flinch when the conductor approached. He didn't lie. "I am colored," he said. 8 words. Then handcuffs. The train didn't stop, but history shuddered. They dragged him off like a thief. Not for stealing, but for sitting, for being, for refusing to vanish into the back of the car, into the back of the country, into the lie that black people were free. That moment would be turned into law 4 years later. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court ruled 7-1 that separate but equal was constitutional. that America could split its citizens down the color line and call it justice. But the court didn't create Jim Crow. It only gave the rope a legal knot. The South already knew how to bind people without chains. They wrote black codes in ink made from fear and power. Every courthouse became a trap. You missed work? Vagrancy. You talked back? Disorderly conduct. You wanted to vote? Pay a tax you couldn't afford. Pass a literacy test written to make you fail. One black man was asked to recite the entire Georgia Constitution backwards. Another had to guess how many jelly beans were in a jar. They called it neutral. They said it wasn't about race. But it always was. The rules were written to be gates. The enforcers were gatekeepers. And the sentence for stepping out of line wasn't just jail. It was death. They hung her from the bridge before sunrise. Mariah, 13 years old, accused of talking too familiar with a white boy. No trial. No judge. Just a mob, a rope, and the silence that followed. Her body swayed over the river, face turned toward a sky that never answered. Carroll County, Mississippi. They found her dress torn, her shoes missing, her wrist broken. No one was punished, because lynching wasn't a secret. It was a performance. It happened in open fields, in courthouse squares, under trees with wide branches and wide-eyed crowds. Mothers brought their children. Vendors sold lemonade. Photographers captured the moment. Postcards were printed. A man could be burned alive, and his ashes mailed across state lines as souvenirs. This was America. Thousands of black bodies destroyed to send one message: know your place. They hung men for voting. They burned women for resisting. They castrated boys for looking the wrong direction. The names piled up. Mary Turner, 8 months pregnant. Georgia, 1918. Her husband had been lynched the day before. She spoke out, said it was wrong. They tied her by the ankles, hung her upside down, slit her belly open with a butcher's knife. Her baby fell to the ground. They stomped it to death. No one went to prison. The law didn't just fail, it helped. Sheriffs looked away. Judges threw out charges. Grand juries refused to indict. Because Jim Crow wasn't just Southern. It was systemic. It was national. It lived in schools that taught children that slavery was a necessary evil. It lived in banks that denied loans, hospitals that turned away bleeding black bodies, cemeteries that segregated the dead. It lived in the North, too, in Boston, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, hidden under polite names, redlining, restrictive covenants, urban renewal. But in the South, it was loud. Signs screamed it from every wall: whites only, colored entrance, no Negroes allowed, water fountains, waiting rooms, bus seats, libraries, beaches, Bibles. Even God was segregated. And still, people fought. They built churches that rang with power, schools in basements, newspapers that spoke truth, quiet revolutions, loud hope. But every step forward came with blood. A black man owns land. His crops are burned. A black woman starts a newspaper. Her presses are smashed. A child wins a scholarship to a white college. Crosses burn outside her door. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." But Jim Crow wasn't a problem. It was a weapon. It was law. It was custom. It was normal. And it worked best when it didn't need to shout, when it whispered into law books and courtrooms and textbooks and minds, when it shaped the world so completely that children were born into its maze and never knew they were trapped. Black children were told they couldn't dream too high, couldn't laugh too loud, couldn't run too far, couldn't be too much, because America had already written their ending, and the page had no light. A black mother watched her son board a train. She packed his lunch in wax paper, wrote his name in the collar of his coat. She told him not to argue, not to look anyone in the eye, not to reach into his pocket too fast. He was 12. She knew, because the law wouldn't protect him. It might kill him. And the train rolled away, into another state, another law, another trap, another noose waiting in another tree. The boy didn't cry, but the wind did. The statue stood silent in the morning fog, 20 feet tall, bronze, cold. A man on horseback, frozen mid-command, sword drawn, eyes fixed somewhere past time itself. Beneath him, a plaque read, "General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, soldier, hero, Christian gentleman." No mention of slavery. No mention of rebellion. No mention of what he fought to preserve. Children walked by it on their way to school, barely looked up. The monument had always been there, like trees, like sky, like gravity. It wasn't questioned. It was truth. This is how the lost cause begins, not with rifles or speeches, but with stone, with silence, with a lie so soft, so steady, that it becomes the air itself. After the war, Southern defeat should have stung like a raw wound. But wounds can be rewritten. By the 1870s, Confederate veterans were already gathering in parlors, writing their version of the story. Not just to remember, but to cleanse. To remove the blood and replace it with honor. Slavery? A footnote. States' rights? The noble cry. Secession? A constitutional disagreement. The South? A land of valor betrayed by Northern aggression and Northern industry. They called it heritage, but it was erasure, and they didn't do it alone. Women's groups, especially the United Daughters of the Confederacy, moved like quiet architects. They didn't carry guns. They carried pens, textbooks, chisel, and hammer. In classrooms, they rewrote the war for children too young to know any better. They published school books that told students the South was fighting for honor, not slavery, that slaves were content, and that the North had trampled the Constitution. Teachers taught it. Students repeated it. Whole generations grew up saluting a past that never existed. Meanwhile, monuments rose like tombstones across the South, hundreds of them. Not during the war, not right after, but between 1890 and 1920, during Jim Crow's darkest reign. Not to mourn the dead, to remind the living. Every statue said, "We are still here. We remember, and we still believe." They put Jefferson Davis in a suit and tie and called him a statesman. They put Lee on a pedestal and called him virtuous. They made traitors into martyrs and turned a rebellion for slavery into a romantic tragedy. And the North? They applauded, because reconciliation was more profitable than truth. Better to shake hands than hold people accountable. So monuments were built with Northern donations. Southern myths appeared in Northern newspapers. White America, exhausted by war and ashamed of black advancement, was all too eager to forget the truth, so long as forgetting looked like unity. Then came the silver screen. Gone with the Wind. It opened to sold-out theaters. White audiences wept, applauded, cheered. The camera swept across cotton fields and burning cities, but never lingered on chains. Never paused on whips. Slavery became background scenery, something soft, distant, almost beautiful. Mammy smiled. The house slaves laughed. The Confederacy bled with honor. Scarlett O'Hara mourned her world, and the nation mourned with her. Margaret Mitchell's words dripped with nostalgia, but not regret. Her South was wounded, not wicked. Her cause was tragic, not criminal. Her Confederacy was pure, ruined by outside forces, never by its own sin. And America believed it. The film became the highest grossing in history. Presidents watched it. Schools showed it. Lines formed around blocks for weeks. Clark Gable was a hero. Vivian Leigh was a goddess. Hattie McDaniel won an Oscar and had to sit at a segregated table while she received it. That moment said more than the film ever could, because the myth had won. The real war, the one fought over black bodies, black futures, black freedom, was erased in frame after frame of soft lighting and Southern charm. No chains, no auctions, no screams, just plantations bathed in gold. Just generals who prayed and fought like knights. Just a people, the white South, robbed of their story. Except they weren't robbed. They rewrote it. And the country let them. Every city square that bore Lee's face. Every textbook that called the war between the states. Every child who learned to call it heritage instead of treason. It all became a wall, built brick by brick to block out the screams of the enslaved and the truth of the war. By the time the civil rights movement rose, the Confederacy had already been sanctified, not as a failed rebellion, but as a misunderstood romance. So when black Americans marched for justice, they didn't just face hoses and dogs. They faced memory, the kind carved in granite, the kind painted across murals, the kind that raised flags not as threats, but as tributes. The lost cause wasn't about forgetting. It was about winning, not on battlefields, but in classrooms, in theaters, in books, in silence. And in that silence, the real cost was buried, beneath statues, beneath lies, beneath the soft lull of a nation that wanted comfort more than it wanted truth. But the lie still stands, and the statue still watches. It was a Tuesday morning in Washington, cold and gray, the kind of morning where breath fogs and boots echo too loudly against stone. January 23, 1877. The city was still, but inside the Willard Hotel, a deal was being made that would kill the last breath of Reconstruction. There were no guns, no shouting, just hands shaking over whiskey and smoke. Northern politicians, Southern Democrats. Silent understanding. They called it compromise. What it really was, abandonment. Rutherford B. Hayes would get the presidency. In return, the federal troops would leave the South. No more protection for black voters. No more enforcement of rights. No more justice. The North turned away, and the South smiled. The betrayal didn't come like thunder. It came like fog, slow, creeping, wrapping around throats and tightening before anyone could scream. In Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, men who had once tasted freedom stood in polling lines, only to be turned away by men who used to own them. The law said they could vote. The night said otherwise. The North built factories, railroads, stretched steel across rivers and land like veins of ambition. They built toward tomorrow and forgot the blood still soaking yesterday. There were profits to chase, coal to mine, immigrants to hire for pennies. The South was the past, a problem they could wash their hands of. Reconstruction had been expensive, tiring, too black, too radical, easier to close the book. Let the South figure itself out. They did. They figured out how to keep power without chains, how to rewrite slavery into a legal code. They figured out literacy tests that could break a man's dignity, poll taxes that starved him of his voice, grandfather clauses that said, "You're only American if your grandfather was free." And when the courts were asked to intervene, they sat back. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. The Supreme Court, in a single ruling, told the country that separate could be equal, that apartheid was constitutional, that skin could decide your seat on a train, your school, your dignity. It wasn't just a Southern verdict. It was national policy. By then, Northern factories hummed with steel and smog, and the Black South was out of sight, out of mind. White Northerners, once fiery abolitionists, shifted their gaze to markets, to modernity, to profit. They still believed in freedom, in theory, but not if it meant risk. Not if it meant war again. Not if it meant standing beside people they had freed but never accepted as equals. The South, meanwhile, had never surrendered its soul. Not really. The plantations had lost their names but kept their shape. Sharecropping replaced slavery. Same land, same poverty, same white overseer with a ledger instead of a whip. Children still called him Mister. Wives still looked down when they passed him on the road. And black men who stood two tall wrist ropes strung over poplar trees, their names erased, their bodies left hanging for crowds to see. The North read about lynchings in the back pages of their newspapers. Sometimes, if at all. Southern problem, they said. They kept building. Electric lights, telegraph wires, skyscrapers. The country was splitting again, not by cannon, but by values. Industrial North. Agrarian South. One chasing the future, the other choking the past until it bled obedience. But here's the truth. The line wasn't clean. Because Southern ideology, white supremacy, racial hierarchy, control through fear, bled into every corner of America. Northern banks underwrote Southern expansion. Wall Street men invested in cotton futures and railroads that stretched through segregated towns. Insurance companies calculated how black life was worth less. Northern newspapers printed stories of Negro crime, fed by Southern sheriffs who smiled for the camera after their prisoners had been lost to a mob. And in Congress, year after year, Southern politicians, backed by white votes, blocked every attempt at equality. And Northern congressmen, eager to keep peace, let them. No riots, no debates, just silence. Every president from Hayes to Wilson looked southward and blinked. They spoke of unity while thousands were hunted for existing. They told themselves that the Constitution couldn't fix culture, that maybe the South needed time, that maybe it wasn't their fight anymore. They handed the fight to the people who could least afford to lose it, to the sharecropper, to the teacher walking miles to reach a one-room schoolhouse with broken windows and no books, to the preacher who dared to say, "We are equal," and found a cross burning on his lawn by morning. The North built its cities and forgot the cost of forgetting. But forgetting is not forgiveness. It is permission. And the South took that permission and made it law. White-only water fountains, colored entrances, black schools that leaked in winter and burned in summer. Police who beat first, asked later. juries that never returned justice, churches that preached grace and practiced hate, all while the country claimed progress. America, the land of freedom. Except freedom had a color code. The North let it happen. They signed trade deals while black towns were drowned by levees that no one rebuilt. They passed housing laws that made sure white families got loans and black families got red lines drawn around their futures. They laid highways that carved through black neighborhoods and called it modernization. They smiled for pictures next to black soldiers returning from war, then ignored the headlines when those same men were beaten for wearing a uniform. This wasn't just Southern resistance. It was national betrayal. It was the quiet agreement that power mattered more than people, that some scars should be ignored for the sake of appearance, that the past would go away if they stopped talking about it. But it didn't. It stayed. In the soil, in the systems, in the breath of every black American who knew that rights on paper meant nothing if the man behind the badge saw you as prey. The South never needed to win the war on paper, because it was winning it in practice. And the North, too busy counting progress in steel and stocks, never noticed that justice had slipped from its hands like dust. And the silence thickened. The flag was red against a summer sky, rippling like fire, arrogant in its stillness. It hung over the South Carolina State House for 38 years. Not on the ground, not hidden in shame, but above the dome, high enough to catch the light of morning and dare the world to look away. It was 1962 when they raised it, nearly a century after the guns fell silent at Appomattox. Not during the war, not in mourning, but at the height of the civil rights movement. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was a message that the South would not forget, that defiance still breathed, and that the Confederate flag was no longer just a ghost of history. It was a weapon reborn. It fluttered there like a smirk, over the building where laws were passed, where voices were silenced, where old money met new power. Beneath it, black citizens entered to plead for justice in a place guarded by a banner that said they were never meant to belong. The flag wasn't about heritage. It was about control. It was about looking a generation of black children in the eye and saying, "We are still here. We still decide." And the North, again, looked away. White supremacy was never confined by geography. It crossed borders like wind, subtle and choking. It didn't need plantations. It needed silence. In Michigan, in Illinois, in California, families waved the same flag, hanging it from porches, tattooing it on arms, sewing it into patches on denim jackets. It no longer mattered if their ancestors fought for the South. They had adopted the cause. Nostalgia for a country that never was, a nation where whiteness ruled without question. It wasn't just the South that clung to it. It was America. And South Carolina? It wore it with pride. In 1948, the state's senior senator, Strom Thurmond, split from the Democratic Party. The reason? Civil rights. The federal government dared to speak of equality, dared to suggest that the Constitution applied to everyone. Thurmond would not stand for it. He stood on a stage in Birmingham and growled, "All the laws of Washington and all the bayonets of the army cannot force the Negro into our homes, our schools, our churches." And the crowd roared. The Dixiecrats were born, not underground, not in the shadows, but on the national stage. They carried the Confederate flag into political campaigns like a holy symbol, not of defeat, of resistance. They lost the election, but they didn't vanish. They went quiet. They waited. In the decades that followed, the map shifted. The Democrats, slowly and painfully, embraced civil rights. The South didn't forget, and neither did the Republican Party. By 1968, Richard Nixon was watching the storm of the 60s, marches, riots, assassinations, and he saw an opportunity. He called it the Southern Strategy. No flags, no open racism, just a nod, just a wink, a whisper that said, "We will protect your way of life." He spoke of law and order. He spoke of states' rights. And the South understood. So did much of the North. Because by then, white voters everywhere were tired. Tired of protests. Tired of demands. Tired of being asked to change. The Southern strategy was never just about the South. It was about white comfort. It was about turning race into a code and dressing hate in a suit. It worked. Nixon won the South. Reagan perfected the method. Bush refined it. Flags waved at rallies again, sometimes tucked behind patriotic slogans, sometimes worn proudly across chests. In 1980, Reagan launched his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, Not Pennsylvania, not the birthplace of the Constitution, but the town where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered in 1964 and buried in an earthen dam. He spoke of states' rights. And the message landed. It always landed. Because the Confederate flag had never died. It had morphed. From battlefield to monument, from classroom to ballot box, from treason to tradition. In 2000, after years of protest, South Carolina finally moved the flag off the dome. Not down, just to the lawn. Still visible, still proud. A compromise, they said. But there is no compromise with hate. Only delay. It took 15 more years and a massacre. On June 17, 2015, a young white man walked into Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. He sat through Bible study. He prayed with them. Then he opened fire. 9 lives. Gone. His photos later surfaced, posing with the Confederate flag, gripping it like a weapon, as if it had whispered in his ear. The state reeled. The country watched. And under pressure, finally, the flag came down. Not folded, not buried, removed. But even then, some wept for it. Not for the dead, not for the decades of pain, for the cloth, for a symbol of defiance that had outlived its army, its leaders, its cause, but not its hate. The Confederate flag was never about history. It was about power. It still is. And power, once granted, does not disappear. It adapts. It hides in speeches and ballots and quiet policies. It trades a rifle for a podium. It leaves the dome, but not the heart. South Carolina only lowered the flag. The country never truly did. The train pulled into Union Station just after dawn. The wind off Lake Michigan cut sharp through the steel bones of Chicago, but the woman stepping off the last car clutched her coat and kept walking. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The city was loud, already awake. But it wasn't welcoming. It was watching. She had left Mississippi behind with nothing but a suitcase and a promise her brother made before they lowered his body into the red dirt. Go north, he said. There's work. There's hope. But the minute her shoe touched the sidewalk, she felt it. The echo. The hum of something older than trains and streets. The war had followed her. It didn't wear gray anymore. It wore uniforms, landlord suits, bank ties, and city zoning maps. The Civil War had changed its battlefield. It wasn't fought with rifles in 1919. It was fought with leases, with sirens that never came, with fires that burned only in black neighborhoods while hoses stayed dry. Chicago's promise of freedom was a bated breath. Black families poured in by the thousands during the Great Migration, fleeing lynch mobs, cotton debts, and Southern sheriffs with blood in their eyes. They came looking for dignity. Instead, they ran straight into the teeth of a Northern backlash that didn't wear a hood, but knew how to choke just the same. In Bronzeville, a 5-room apartment might hold 3 families. Not by choice, but by red lines drawn by white hands behind closed doors. Banks circled maps with blue ink and coded intent, D for decline, H for hazardous. It was never about the houses. It was about the people in them. You could work in the slaughterhouses, in the mills, on the line at the Ford plant, but you couldn't live next door. You could wear the uniform, but you couldn't borrow the money to buy the house. You could die for the country, but you couldn't swim in the same pool. In Detroit, the same war raged, quiet at first, like the stillness before a bomb drops. The black population grew from 5,000 in 1910 to over 120,000 by the 1930s. And with every arrival, another neighborhood turned its face. It started with signs, for whites only, restricted covenant, no coloreds after dark. But those signs were just introductions. In 1942, a black family tried to move into a home in a white neighborhood on Detroit's west side. The house was brick. Small. Nothing grand. But to the mob of 700 white rioters who swarmed it, it was treason. They smashed windows. They burned furniture. They threw rocks and curses and gasoline. The police arrested the family, not the mob. And when a court ruled in Corrigan versus Buckley that racially restrictive covenants were legal, the nation shrugged. It had always known. It just never said it aloud. White supremacy had traveled well. It no longer needed plantations. It had real estate offices, zoning commissions, and homeowner associations. It had the law. The Civil War's ideology, black as lesser, black as threat, black as trespass, had been poured into the foundation of the American city like wet concrete, hardened into street grids, etched into zip codes. It wasn't a Southern relic. It was national DNA. It didn't wear a uniform. It didn't wave a flag. But it built invisible walls. White Chicagoans who never owned a slave, who never wore gray, still crossed the street at the sight of a black man. They still locked their doors when a black child rode past on a bike. They still paid more to keep their schools white, their blocks white, their daughters white by proximity. In 1919, it exploded. The summer was hot. The city was tense. A black teenager, Eugene Williams, drifted on a raft into the white section of a segregated beach. He was stoned in the water. He drowned. Police refused to arrest the white man responsible. Black residents took to the streets. White gangs followed, armed with clubs and bricks and knives. For 13 days, the city was a battlefield. Fires lit the sky. Homes were razed. Bodies lay twisted in alleyways. 38 people died. Over 500 were injured. Most of them were black. The Civil War had never ended. It just moved north, into brick tenements and blood-stained gutters, into courtrooms and tax codes, into a nation that congratulated itself for defeating the Confederacy while quietly carrying its blueprint into every urban planning meeting. In the decades that followed, black families were herded into ghettos, denied credit, boxed in by highways and policy. The projects rose like tombstones, stacked, fenced, forgotten. Hope was sold block by block, priced out of reach. But still, they fought. They marched. They built. They taught their children to stand straight, even when the ceiling pressed down like a palm on a neck. But the backlash never stopped. Every gain sparked a recoil. Every inch forward dragged a chain behind it. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. marched through white Chicago neighborhoods, not Alabama, not Mississippi. And he said it plainly. I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago. That wasn't the South. That was the myth exposed. Because the Civil War was never about geography. It was about power. And power doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. It simply moves. From cotton fields to factories. From Confederate statues to banking policies. From lynching trees to mortgage rates. It builds fences with laws and bullets with silence. It looks like progress. But underneath, it still burns. Still waits. Still watches. It was May 2nd, 1963. In Birmingham, Alabama, the morning sun rose over a city holding its breath. Then came the sirens. Children, some only 12 years old, lined up outside the 16th Street Baptist Church. They weren't playing. They weren't laughing. They held signs in trembling hands. I am a man. We want freedom. Segregation must go. They sang, but not like children. They sang like warriors who knew that the moment they stepped onto the sidewalk, they were marching into war. Bull Connor was waiting. The hoses groaned before they screamed. Water hit skin like whips. Fire hoses, turned to full power, blasted their small bodies across the pavement. Dogs lunged. Teeth tore at sleeves, at legs, at skin. Police dragged them by the arms, slammed them into wagons. Over 1,000 were arrested. And yet they kept coming. March after march, wave after wave, the streets became rivers of fire and purpose. Birmingham didn't burn from matches. It burned from the sheer force of resistance rising from the soles of children's shoes. This wasn't a beginning. This was a return. Because the civil rights movement was not born in the 1950s. It had always been there. In the ashes of Reconstruction, in the prayers of sharecroppers, in the quiet refusal of black soldiers who came home from war and refused to enter through back doors. It was the same war. Only the uniforms had changed. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education cracked the mask. The Supreme Court said what Black America had known since 1865, separate but equal, was a lie. But the ruling didn't come with escorts. It didn't come with protection. It came with rage. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 3 years later, that rage took form. 9 teenagers. Pressed clothes. Straight backs. Books held tight. They walked into Central High School while a mob roared around them. Spit flew. Slurs cut the air like blades. The governor ordered the National Guard, not to protect them, but to block them. President Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne. Bayonets glinted in the Arkansas sun as soldiers surrounded black children like a human shield. And still, when they sat in classrooms, white students turned their backs. Pencils snapped in silence. Hate radiated from every corner. This wasn't resistance. This was Reconstruction all over again. When Black Americans had once dared to vote, to lead, to govern, and were crushed under boots, bullets, and betrayal. In Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress sat quietly on a bus in 1955. Her name was Rosa Parks, but the stillness of her defiance echoed like thunder. She said no, and that single syllable shook the foundations of the old order. For 381 days, Black residents walked, miles to work, in rain, in heat. Their shoes wore thin, but their resolve did not. The bus boycott wasn't about buses. It was about dignity. It was about breaking the spine of a system that had taken so much and dared to ask for more. Every march in the civil rights era was a confrontation with ghosts. In Selma, 1965, they walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a Confederate general, a Klansman. A name carved in metal like a wound left open. They carried nothing but faith and courage. The state troopers waited, clubs raised, gas canisters uncapped. And as the marchers reached the crest of that bridge, America once again showed its face. Hard, white, and brutal. They beat them bloody. John Lewis's skull cracked. Dozens trampled. Blood soaked into the concrete. The world watched. But not for the first time. This wasn't new. This was the Confederacy whispering through time, wrapped in uniforms of blue but bearing the same hatred, the same need to control, the same fear of Black autonomy. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew it. When he spoke at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, he didn't speak of dreams alone. He spoke of broken promises, of the check that had come back marked insufficient funds. He said it plain. This nation has defaulted on its promise to its Black citizens. When he marched in Chicago, when he stood in front of mobs in Gage Park, he felt it. Not the Southern sneer, but the Northern smirk. The polite racism, the kind that smiles while it strangles. In 1968, he went to Memphis, not for glory, but for garbage workers striking for the right to be seen as men. His last speech wasn't a celebration. It was a warning. "I've been to the mountaintop," he said. "I may not get there with you." The next day, April 4th, he was gunned down on a balcony. One shot, one body, one nation unmasked again. They buried him in Atlanta, but the movement didn't die. It couldn't, because it wasn't his. It belonged to the thousands who marched with worn shoes and broken bodies, to the mothers who never slept, to the teenagers who went to jail more often than prom, to the grandfathers who saw history repeat itself in the lines of their sons' faces. The civil rights movement was not a phase. It was not a protest trend. It was the second phase of Reconstruction, unfinished, unresolved, and met again with a counterattack just as ruthless as the first. Only this time, the battlegrounds had shifted. They were buses, lunch counters, courtrooms, but the enemy was the same. The myth of white supremacy, the refusal to cede power, the lie that equality had already been achieved. There was no peace. There was only the illusion of progress, shadowed by the next crackdown, the next bullet, the next excuse. The same war still raging. The air was thick with sweat and dust, and the ground pulsed under 1,000 polished shoes. It was August 3rd, 1980. Philadelphia, Mississippi. The crowd waited, restless, under the Mississippi sun, in a place still known for 3 bodies buried in red clay: James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. Civil rights workers, murdered in 1964. Forgotten by most, not by the soil. And then came the voice. Ronald Reagan stepped onto the stage and smiled. He didn't mention the murders. He didn't speak of ghosts. He said 2 words: states' rights. And with that, the past wasn't just remembered. It was revived. That phrase had been buried in white robes and courtrooms for over a century, used to justify the unthinkable. Slavery, secession, segregation. But here it was again, scrubbed clean and dressed in the suit of a former actor with perfect hair and a perfect smile. He said it with charm. The crowd heard it with understanding. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't need to say, because they already knew. The war had never ended. It had just changed languages. 16 years earlier, the map turned crimson. Not with blood, but with politics. The South had once been solidly Democratic, the party of segregationists, of Jim Crow, of George Wallace snarling into microphones. But when the Civil Rights Act passed, the plates beneath American politics began to shift. President Lyndon B. Johnson knew what it meant. He signed that law and told an aide, "We've lost the South for a generation." He was wrong. They lost it forever. And waiting in the wings was Richard Nixon. Cold, calculating, unforgiving. He didn't need crosses burning on front lawns. He didn't need mobs in the streets. All he needed was silence and a strategy. It was called the Southern Strategy, not shouted from rooftops, but whispered through poll-tested lines. Words like law and order, local control, neighborhood schools. It was politics soaked in racial tension, but framed in respectability. The violence didn't disappear. It just took off its hood and put on a lapel pin. In 1968, Nixon ran on fear. Black crime, student riots, cities on fire. He pointed to unrest and promised peace, but not the kind of peace that justice brings. He promised a return to order, to tradition, to the way things were before. The Confederacy nationalized. It wasn't the rebel yell anymore. It was a campaign jingle, a wink, a knowing nod. George Wallace, the Alabama governor who once screamed segregation forever, ran too. And though he lost, his votes carved new boundaries. Nixon learned from him, not how to speak, but how to whisper. By 1972, the transformation was complete. The South had flipped, not just in flags, but in ballots. And the country followed. Because racism didn't stay regional, it grew legs. It wore different faces. It wrapped itself in tax policy and housing codes. It moved to suburbs, boarded up urban cores, passed laws about welfare queens and super predators. Each phrase a scalpel, surgical, denied, defended, but always aimed in the same direction. Reagan perfected the performance. He didn't need to shout. He told stories about a man in a Cadillac picking up food stamps, about the hardworking, silent majority taxed and ignored. He smiled as he said them, but behind the charm was a blueprint, one where the Southern way of thinking didn't stay below the Mason-Dixon line. It climbed into California, into Wisconsin, into Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. Confederate memory became American strategy. White grievance became a national currency. When Reagan gave that states' rights speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, he wasn't lost. He was sending a signal. They heard it in Georgia. They heard it in Indiana. They heard it in the halls of Congress. The war had never ended. It had just moved. Now it wasn't fought with muskets. It was fought with electoral maps, with dog whistles, with think tanks and TV ads. The ghosts of Vicksburg and Appomattox weren't resting. They were standing in line, waiting to vote. The symbols spread faster than fire. Confederate flags on T-shirts in Idaho. Statues of Lee in Arizona. High schools named after Jefferson Davis in places where he never set foot. This wasn't about history. It was about ownership, about who America belonged to. The South had lost the war, but they were winning the peace. The battlefield had changed, but the terms were the same. White dominance, black obedience. And now it wasn't enforced by whips or chains, but by policies, by zoning laws, by minimum sentences, by tough on crime, bills passed by men who'd never seen the inside of the neighborhoods they condemned. The South didn't rise again. It never fell. Because Nixon built the bridge. Reagan lit the way. And every coded phrase became a footstep in that long, cold march. Every speech about inner cities or welfare reform was just another verse in the same old hymn. They called it a strategy, but it was an inheritance. Paid in bones, paid in ballots, paid in silence. And when Reagan won 49 states in 1984, the crowd didn't cheer policy. They cheered restoration, not of balance, of power, of place, of the way things were supposed to be. It wasn't Southern anymore. It was American. The ink was still wet. The war was over, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was something colder, something unfinished. Washington, D.C., July 9, 1868. The 14th Amendment was ratified. Not celebrated, ratified. It was not born in joy, but in ash and blood. It arrived not as a promise fulfilled, but as a battlefield redrawn. Words on paper, scrawled over the ruins of a country that still flinched at the idea of equality. Equal protection under the law, it said. But no law bled when a black child was dragged from a classroom. No justice choked when a voter was turned away at gunpoint. The Constitution had survived the war, but it had not yet survived the truth. And in the quiet halls of Congress, they began writing an amendment they barely believed in. The 14th was a ghost in chains, freed in law, but not in life. It said every person born on American soil was a citizen. But when black men tried to claim that citizenship in the streets of Memphis or New Orleans, they were met with torchlight, gunfire, and silence. The 15th followed in 1870. It gave black men the right to vote. But what it gave in ink, states took back in shadows. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, white-only primaries. And when that wasn't enough, they used ropes. They used fire. Every vote cast by a black man in Mississippi was a loaded gun pointed at white supremacy. And so they answered with bullets. The battlefield had moved from open fields to ballot boxes, from bayonets to ballots. But the war raged on. Reconstruction wasn't a rebuilding. It was a standoff. Federal troops guarded polling places like forts. Southern legislatures plotted revenge like generals. The Constitution had been amended, but not accepted. The ink on those amendments never dried. It kept bleeding. And the states waited. Waited for the North to grow tired. For the outrage to burn out. For the soldiers to go home. They were patient. They always had been. By 1877, they won. The federal government pulled out. And the South moved in. Jim Crow wasn't a return to slavery. It was worse. Slavery had rules. This had madness. Arbitrary power. Racial terror carved into law. And the 14th and 15th Amendments stood by like condemned monuments, unread and unused. The Constitution was unfinished, not because it needed more words, but because the words had never been lived. They were turned into weapons by those who claimed to protect them. States' rights, they said, as they banned black voters. Local control, they said, as they drew county lines that split black communities down the middle. Voting rights became the front line, and it always has been. Because the vote isn't just a ballot, it's a threat, a reshaping of power, a declaration of personhood. And in America, personhood is political. Selma, Alabama, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a Confederate officer, still standing. John Lewis stood on that bridge with nothing but a coat and a backpack. In it, fruit, a book, a toothbrush. He thought he would be arrested. Instead, he was beaten until his skull cracked. Television screens across the country flickered with black bodies crumpled beneath batons. And for a brief moment, America looked into its own mirror and recoiled. The Voting Rights Act passed that summer. Lyndon B. Johnson signed it with the weight of history pressing against his pen. But the war wasn't over. It just changed its tactics again. Federal versus state. It's the same story, told in different accents. Every expansion of federal authority to protect black voting rights has been met with lawsuits, with resistance, with claims of overreach. States don't say we want to suppress black voters. They say election integrity. They say fraud. They say local governance. But the effect is the same as it was in 1877. Same lines, same silence, same fear. Shelby County versus Holder. The Supreme Court gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act. Said times had changed. Said the protections were outdated. Said states no longer needed federal approval to change voting laws. Within hours, they did. Voter ID laws. Closed polling places. Purged voter rolls. It didn't matter that it was legal. So was slavery once. So was segregation. So was every injustice that wrapped itself in law like a shroud. The 14th Amendment still says equal protection. But what is protection if it only comes after the harm? What is equality if it must be begged for? And the 15th? It still says no one shall be denied the right to vote on account of race. But they don't say it's because of race. They never do. They say it's about crime. They say it's about resources. They say it's about process. They smile as they say it. The Constitution is unfinished not because we haven't written enough, but because we have never had the courage to live what we already wrote. And so the fight continues. In courthouses and classrooms. In bus stops and Supreme Court chambers. On ballots and bridges. Every vote cast in America is a footstep in a centuries-old march. Some walk freely. Some crawl. Some are trampled. But still they come. Still they try. Because the 14th and 15th Amendments are not relics. They are warnings. Testimonies. They are scars in legal form. And the ink still has not dried. A blast tore the face off the building. April 19th, 1995, 9:02 a.m. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City was there, and then it wasn't. A 9-month-old girl was found crushed beneath the debris. The blast had thrown her through the air, her body limp in a blanket, her blood mixing with concrete dust. She hadn't yet learned to walk. Timothy McVeigh had parked a Ryder truck filled with 2 tons of homemade explosives just outside. He lit the fuse and walked away. There was no warning, no second thoughts. He called it justice. He called it revolution. But the body said something else. 168 people died that morning. Among them were babies in a daycare center, government workers, a Marine, a nurse, a rescue worker crushed while trying to save someone else. For them, there was no war. There was only the fire, the sound of metal folding, the glass slicing, the floor vanishing. McVeigh wasn't just angry. He was armed, with ideology, with conviction, with the twisted righteousness that grows in the dark when men convince themselves the government is an enemy and that killing innocents is liberty's price. He thought he was a patriot. He thought he was finishing what had been started long ago. The Second Amendment. 1 sentence, 27 words. But in that space, whole empires of rage and myth have been built. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The founders wrote it while memories of redcoats and revolution were still fresh. But it didn't stay in 1791. It was dragged forward, reloaded, and pointed inward. Confederates read it as a birthright to defy federal power. Slave patrols were their well-regulated militia. They wielded guns to keep black people from freedom, from rebellion, from being seen as human. After 1865, the Confederacy fell, but its spirit stayed armed. Waco, Texas, 1993. The ATF moved in on a compound owned by David Koresh and his followers. The Branch Davidians believed the end of days was coming. They believed the U.S. government was evil. They were armed to the teeth. Rifles, grenades, .50 caliber machine guns. They saw the agents not as lawmen, but as tyrants. The standoff lasted 51 days. Then came the fire. 76 people dead, including children. Smoke poured into the sky like a flag of grief. In its ashes, militias found their prophecy. Ruby Ridge, Idaho, 1992. Randy Weaver didn't trust the government. He believed in white separatism. He built his life off the grid. The federal agents who tried to arrest him ended up in a shootout. His 14-year-old son, Sammy, was shot in the back. His wife, Vicky, was holding a baby when a bullet tore through her head. In right-wing circles, these names, Waco, Ruby Ridge, became sacred. Not tragedies, rallying cries. The militia movement surged. They called themselves defenders, patriots, sons of liberty. They trained in forests, stockpiled weapons, passed out copies of the Constitution like scripture, always dog-eared at the Second Amendment. But they weren't preparing for foreign invaders. They were preparing for war against their own country. They used the flag, but they redefined the meaning. They used the founders' words, but only the ones that fit their rage. They wore camouflage, not to hide from enemies abroad, but from neighbors they now saw as traitors. Federal agents, immigrants, liberals, journalists, anyone who challenged their imagined frontier. It wasn't just guns. It was grievance. It was the Confederate dream repackaged, not in gray uniforms, but in flak jackets. Not on horseback, but in pickup trucks with rifles mounted in the back. These were not isolated men. They were part of something older. A story whispered in gun smoke and static radio. A belief that the Civil War never really ended. That Reconstruction was a crime. That the federal government is an occupying force. That white power must be protected, by force if necessary. They believed secession wasn't a failure. It was a prophecy yet to be fulfilled, and the Second Amendment was their scripture. But the Constitution didn't give them what they claimed. It didn't grant the right to slaughter, to bomb courthouses, to build armies in shadows. But they twisted it, and that twisting killed. They said Ruby Ridge proved the government murders families. That Waco showed the feds were out of control. That Oklahoma City was vengeance. But there were no tanks at Oklahoma City. No siege. No armed standoff. Just workers sipping coffee. Parents dropping off children. Civil servants unlocking doors. And then, nothing. The floor fell through. The walls ripped open like skin. And all that was left was the sound of sirens and the echo of a lie. The lie that the gun is sacred. That every grievance must carry a barrel. That liberty is something to be defended by force, not expanded by law. And still, the militias spread. Montana, Michigan, Arizona, Idaho. They trained with maps, targets, radios. They rehearsed the fall of the republic in their minds, convinced it was already happening. To them, every tax was tyranny. Every election a fraud. Every federal law a boot on their throat. They weren't protecting liberty. They were preparing for insurrection. And that Confederate flag? It never left their hearts. It flew again, on hats, on patches, sometimes even next to the American one, as if the two could exist side by side. But they can't, because the Second Amendment, written to secure a free state, has been turned into a weapon against the state itself. And now the line between patriot and terrorist blurs. They say the government cannot be trusted. They say we the people means we with the guns. And every time another building falls, or another agent dies, or another child's name is read in mourning, they say it's freedom. They call it resistance. But what it is war. Not declared, not clean, a slow war. The kind that hides in slogans, in survivalist forums, in basements filled with ammo and rage. A war where the battlefield is belief itself. And it's still going, still bleeding, still burning, waiting for the next spark. The man stood behind bulletproof glass, his hand raised, his voice steady. January 20th, 2009. The air was sharp with winter, but the crowd didn't move. They filled the National Mall, shoulder to shoulder, black and white, young and old, some crying openly, others stone-faced, all silent except for the breath in their chests. There were veterans in uniform, civil rights elders in wheelchairs, children hoisted on shoulders to see what their grandparents once thought impossible. Barack Hussein Obama raised his right hand. 44th President of the United States. The first black man to take the oath. The ground didn't shake. The sky didn't split. But something old and buried stirred under the surface of the nation. A silence cracked open like a coffin. And from it, the bones of resentment rose. Not everyone was cheering. Not everyone saw history. Some saw betrayal. Their country was now led by a man with a foreign name and brown skin. That moment, that oath, was a victory for one America and a declaration of war for another. The war didn't come with bullets. Not yet. It came with lies. He's not American. He's Muslim. He hates white people. He wasn't born here. He forged his birth certificate. He wants to destroy the Constitution. He's coming for your guns. He's coming for your God. The birther movement began like a virus with a purpose. It wasn't about facts. It was about humiliation, about stripping him of belonging, about making millions believe that the very thing that made him president, his citizenship, was a fraud. Donald Trump stood at the front of it, camera lights catching the smug defiance in his eyes as he demanded to see Obama's papers like a plantation overseer demanding freedom papers from a free man. It wasn't politics. It was ownership. The kind that said, you don't belong here. The kind that said, you were never meant to rise this high. And still, Obama smiled. He smiled when they yelled. He smiled when they chanted. He smiled when congressmen shouted, you lie, in the middle of a State of the Union. But behind the glass, behind the grin, he knew what it was. He knew that Reconstruction had always had its backlash, that for every step forward, there would be blood under the heel. And so came the Tea Party. They wrapped themselves in flags, held up signs about tyranny, shouted about taxes and socialism. But their rage had a color. Their protest had a smell of the old South, of angry men who remembered what it felt like to win every time. They called themselves patriots, but what they wanted was a return. Not to 2008, not to 2000, not even to 1964. They wanted to go back further. Before the Voting Rights Act, before Brown versus Board, before Lincoln, their signs screamed about taking their country back. But no one ever asked from whom. It was no accident their protests swelled when Obama spoke about healthcare, when he talked about helping the poor, when he dared to say that government should protect the weak. Because in their bones, they heard something else. They heard the drumbeat of Reconstruction. They saw the ghost of the Freedmen's Bureau, of federal troops protecting the rights of people they once owned. They saw the second coming of the Yankee. And so they fought back, not with cannons, but with redistricting maps, with voter ID laws, with gerrymanders that carved black voices out of political life like surgeons working in reverse. They called it reform. They said it was about fraud. But it was the same game the South had played in 1877. Suppress, control, whitewash. They weren't defending the Constitution. They were resurrecting the Confederacy. Not with flags this time, but with algorithms. With angry hosts on cable news. With forums full of code words and slogans. With politicians who said states' rights and men our rights, not theirs. The rhetoric of the lost cause came back in new suits. They didn't say slave. They said welfare. They didn't say Negro rule. They said urban crime. They didn't say white supremacy. They said real America. But the meaning never changed. And still, Obama kept speaking to hope, to reason, to unity. But unity was never what they wanted. They wanted obedience. They wanted the presidency to feel like theirs again, like it had under Reagan, or Nixon, or Jackson. They hated him for being calm, for being elegant, for being everything they said black men couldn't be without their permission. He wore their hatred like armor. Every insult, every cartoon with big lips, every microphone stuffed with bile. He swallowed it all. But hatred doesn't sit still. It grows. By 2010, the backlash was in full bloom. Tea Party candidates flooded Congress, shouting about liberty, about taxation, about government overreach. But beneath the slogans was the oldest fear in America. What if we're no longer on top? They didn't say it. They didn't need to. It showed in their votes, in the way they stood when Obama walked into the chamber, in the way they refused to call him president, in the way they celebrated when legislation failed, not because it was wrong, but because he had proposed it. It was never about policy. It was always about position. Their America didn't have a black man in charge, so they made him illegitimate, by law, by rumor, by sheer repetition. They never impeached him, but they tried to erase him piece by piece. And still he endured. He watched as white supremacists crawled from their caves with torches and swastikas, as cable news gave them airtime, as police shot black men and women and the nation flinched, then forgot. He gave eulogies. He sang Amazing Grace. He wiped tears from his eyes after Sandy Hook. And still, they said he was weak. Or worse, un-American. But nothing was more American than Barack Obama standing in that place, with that name and that skin, refusing to shrink. And nothing was more Confederate than the rage that answered. A rage still wrapped in stars and bars. Still whispering through talk radio. Still marching with tiki torches. Still waiting for its flag to rise again. The torches lit up the Virginia night like a sickness. August 11th, 2017. Charlottesville stood still, ancient brick buildings casting long shadows on the University of Virginia campus. Then came the chanting. First a whisper, then a roar. Voices, angry, guttural, carried across the lawn like smoke. You will not replace us. A beat. Then, Jews will not replace us. The flames from the tiki torches flickered in their eyes. Not for light, not for warmth, but for intimidation. Hundreds of white men, some in polos, some in camouflage, many with shaved heads, marched in a column of rage, their footsteps pounding out a rhythm older than the nation itself. It wasn't just a protest. It was an awakening, not of something new, but of something buried and rotting. The Confederacy was speaking again. They circled the statue of Thomas Jefferson like wolves. They had come to defend Robert E. Lee. They said, a monument, bronze and stone. But what they came to defend wasn't made of metal. It was made of memory, of lies, of blood. That statue in Emancipation Park had stood for almost a century, but they treated its potential removal like desecration, as if Robert E. Lee was their martyr, their Christ, as if losing him would mean losing their place atop the altar of history. The next day, August 12th, the sun rose over a city split open. Counter-protesters poured in. Students, clergy, Black Lives Matter organizers, local residents, ordinary people who could not, would not, stand silent. They held signs. They held hands. They held their breath. Across the street, the neo-Nazis wore helmets, shields. Open-carry firearms gleamed in the morning light. They came not to protest, but to conquer, to stomp their boots into the soil and remind the country that white supremacy had never left. It had just waited. Then came the impact. Heather Heyer was standing at 4th and Water Street when the Dodge Challenger came screaming down the road. The engine roared, tires squealed, and then the sound no one ever forgets. The dull, heavy thud of metal hitting flesh. Bodies flew. Screams filled the air. Blood painted the pavement. Heather was 32. She had come to stand against hate. She never left. And yet, when the world turned its eyes to Charlottesville, the White House looked away. President Donald Trump stepped to the microphone, August 15th, 2017. Cameras rolled. Reporters held their pens. The country braced. There were very fine people on both sides, he said. The words dropped like acid, not because they were confusing, but because they were clear. The President of the United States had just blurred the line between torch-bearing Nazis and those who stood against them. He had lifted the Confederacy out of its grave and given it a seat in the present. He had placed Heather's blood on the same moral shelf as the men who marched for Robert E. Lee with swastikas in their hands. This wasn't a slip. It was a signal. The war over the statues was never about history. It was about power, identity, control. Every Confederate monument wasn't just a soldier on a horse. It was a claim, a declaration that this place, this town, this courthouse, this park belonged to them. The defenders of these statues said they were protecting heritage, but their chants gave them away. You don't scream blood and soil to defend a bronze likeness. You scream it when you think the soil is yours, and the blood, too. Charlottesville wasn't the beginning. It was the boiling point. Across the South, monuments had begun to fall. New Orleans, Durham, Baltimore. City councils debated, police braced, and protesters gathered under the watchful eyes of men cast in iron. Lee, Davis, Forrest, generals of a lost war, turned into idols of a cause that never surrendered. Each time a statue fell, another fire lit in the hearts of those who still believed the South had been wronged, not defeated. They mourned monuments like they mourned a whitewashed past. And each time they lost ground, their rage grew sharper, louder, more violent. Charlottesville made that rage visible. It carved the hate into broad daylight. And when the president refused to call it what it was, he gave them breath, gave them cover, gave them a wink. They heard it loud and clear. They carried it into school board meetings, into state houses, into internet forums that reeked of the same old bile in newer fonts. They slapped heritage stickers on pickup trucks and screamed Southern pride, while waving flags that never flew over the Capitol. And everywhere, the statues loomed, cold, watching. They were never neutral. They were placed in front of courthouses to remind the newly freed who still held the whip. Placed in parks to rewrite defeat into nobility. Placed on pedestals because history, they knew, isn't written in books. It's carved in stone and built high enough that children grow up looking up at it. Robert E. Lee never asked for those monuments. He died in 1870 and said it was time to move on. But the men who came after him knew better. They knew the war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new battlefield. Charlottesville was one skirmish. But it bared the truth. The Confederacy still breathes. It breathes in the statues. It breathes in the streets renamed for traitors. It breathes in the silences after the violence, the murmured excuses, the refusal to look too closely. It breathes in the very fine people. And it waits. The glass shattered first. A single crack in the Capitol's eastern windows, sharp, violent, unnatural. Then the wood splintered. Boots on marble. Screams in the rotunda. Gas masks pulled down over panicked faces. The United States Congress, once the sanctuary of democratic power, was under siege. It was January 6, 2021. Outside, the sky was cold and gray, but inside, beneath the dome painted with the apotheosis of Washington, something darker stirred. The flags told the story better than the chants ever could. Not just the stars and stripes, but the battle flag of the Confederacy, red, blue, and white, carried high through the very halls where Union soldiers once slept during Lincoln's War. It was a flag that had never made it past the Capitol steps in 1861. On this day, it floated under chandeliers and beside busts of abolitionists, daring history to speak. A man marched through the halls with that flag slung over his shoulder as if planting it in enemy ground. He wasn't alone. They came in waves. Horn helmets, combat gear, homemade gallows. They had come to stop the steal, but what they really came for was something far older. They came to finish what the Confederacy had started. Inside the Senate chamber, rioters rifled through desks like thieves in a sacred place. One man stood where the vice president had been moments earlier, clenched fist raised in triumph. Another scrawled, "Murder the media," on a door. Blood smeared the marble. Officers screamed into radios. A woman was shot outside the speaker's lobby. Her name was Ashley Babbitt. She died wearing a Trump flag like a cape. The chants outside the building shook the ground. Hang Mike Pence. 1776. They weren't metaphors. These were battle cries. And the noose they built wasn't just symbolic. It swayed gently in the winter wind, tied and tested. That gallows stood not far from where Abraham Lincoln took his second oath of office, vowing to finish the work of a war he had never wanted to fight. And now, more than 150 years later, the enemy was no longer marching across state lines. It had entered through the front door. Some wore patches, oath keepers, 3%ers, Proud Boys. Some carried shields made from plywood. Others brought bear spray, tasers, crowbars. They spoke in slogans and hashtags, but their eyes told a different story. They came with fury sharpened over years. Fed by lies, yes, but those lies fed on something even older. A belief that this nation belonged to them, and only them. That elections were sacred only when they won. That violence wasn't betrayal, it was heritage. The Civil War never ended. It changed uniforms. Back in 1860, 11 Southern states rejected the results of an election. They saw Lincoln's victory as illegitimate, his ideals as a threat to their way of life. So they seceded, declared themselves a separate country, raised arms against the Union. And now, in 2021, that same impulse gripped thousands. But this time, there were no secession papers, no cannon at Fort Sumter, just tweets, just slogans, just a crowd told, hour after hour, that their country had been stolen, their voices silenced, their race erased. The man who fueled that fire was watching from behind bulletproof glass, telling them he loved them. They believed him. And when they forced the Capitol Police to retreat, when they beat officers with American flags, when they shattered windows older than their grandparents, when they screamed the name of the Confederacy without ever saying it, they weren't trying to defend democracy. They were trying to reclaim it for themselves. They called themselves patriots, but their boots stomped on the very thing patriots had once died to protect. One man wore a sweatshirt that read Camp Auschwitz. Another carried zip ties like he was preparing for hostages. And still, they shouted, "This is our house." It was never just about one election. It was about the ghost of 1865 clawing its way out of the past. That year, the year the Confederacy fell and Lee surrendered, wasn't a burial. It was a burial attempt. But the body was never cold. And January 6th proved the heart was still beating. They spoke in 19th century language with 21st century tools. Secession, treason, tyranny, civil war. They wrapped it in flags and hashtags, but it was the same old song, sung in a new key. And then there were the faces of the officers, bleeding, bruised, gasping through tear gas. One black officer faced a man holding a Confederate flag and asked him why he came. The man answered, "To take our country back." Back from who? The Confederate flag had never entered the U.S. Capitol during the war. Not once. But on that day, it brushed against the bronze of civil rights statues, against the velvet ropes that tried to hold the tide. It mocked everything it passed. It was a symbol of defeat reborn as defiance. Inside the rotunda, where great men lay in state, the rioters took selfies. One left a note on Nancy Pelosi's desk, "We will not back down." Another urinated on the floor outside a congressional office. The message wasn't coded. It was loud, clear, and old. "We own this." At 2:13 p.m., lawmakers were evacuated, huddled beneath chairs, running through tunnels, shouting prayers into phones. The fear was not theatrical. It was primal. A sitting Congress, under armed threat, barricaded in its own house. It wasn't just a mob. It was a reckoning. And still, the war drums beat. One man in a Revolutionary War costume stood on the Senate dais. Another waved a yellow "Don't Tread on Me" flag beneath the rotunda's oculus, as if summoning something ancient. And in their wake, they left behind broken glass, shattered trust, and a trail of echoes. Echoes of Richmond, of Fort Sumter, of Appomattox, of every fire that was never put out. The Union had won the war on paper, but the Confederacy had waited, in textbooks, in monuments, in silence. January 6th was not a beginning. It was a continuation. The question now wasn't whether the Civil War had ended. The question was, when will it finally end? The child raised her hand slowly. 5th grade, Texas, 2023. The classroom was warm, but her fingers were cold with hesitation. She had just read aloud from her history book, flat, polished words about the Civil War, about states' rights, about economic differences. The word slavery had appeared once. Just once. No chains, no auctions, no screaming mothers, no stolen children, just labor systems in the South. She paused and asked the question that shattered the silence. But didn't they own people? The teacher froze, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she knew the consequences. She had been warned. The state had passed a law, House Bill 3979. No divisive concepts. No discomfort based on race. No suggesting that the United States was anything but a shining, exceptional beacon. She looked at the little girl with her honest eyes and her open mouth and said quietly, "That's not part of the standard curriculum." Outside that classroom, across counties and states, the same storm raged. Books pulled from shelves, lessons rewritten, words censored, entire truths cut like tumors from the body of American history. In Florida, a new textbook described enslaved Africans as having developed skills which, in some instances, could be applied for their personal benefit. It read like praise, like gratitude, as if bondage had been a trade school. No mention of whips, no mention of rape, no mention of children torn from their mothers at sunrise, never seen again. In Tennessee, teachers were told not to suggest that white people benefited from slavery, that doing so could make students feel guilty. And in Virginia, a bill proposed that schools notify parents anytime a book might cause emotional distress. Truth, it seemed, had become the enemy. But this war didn't start in the 2020s. It started in school boards, in quiet edits, in soft lies with loud consequences. In 2010, the Texas State Board of Education approved social studies standards that downplayed slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. Instead, they elevated sectionalism and states' rights. Textbooks followed their lead. For millions of students, the war became a misunderstanding, not a moral reckoning. This wasn't education. It was erasure. Every generation is taught a version of America. But who decides the version? The battlefield moved from blood-soaked fields like Antietam and Shiloh to whiteboards and lesson plans. Instead of bullets, there were board votes. Instead of generals, there were governors. By 2021, critical race theory had become a ghost everyone was told to fear, even if few could define it. It wasn't taught in elementary schools. It wasn't in textbooks. But it became the rallying cry for a new kind of lost cause. Crowds showed up to school board meetings with signs, "Stop indoctrinating our kids. America is not racist." Some shouted until they were dragged out. Others wept on the mic about what their children were being taught. But what they feared wasn't a theory. They feared a mirror. Because mirrors show everything. The wounds, the ugliness, the scars that never healed. And so, they smashed them. Banned the books. Banned the terms. Banned the questions. In Oklahoma, House Bill 1775 made it illegal to teach that anyone is inherently racist or should feel discomfort because of race. But how do you teach slavery without discomfort? How do you speak of lynching, of Jim Crow, of Emmett Till, and not feel something shift in your chest? You don't. That's the point. That pain is part of the truth. But in this new war, pain was proof of guilt. And guilt was forbidden. So, new textbooks removed the sting. They replaced enslaved people with workers. They cut out images of the Middle Passage. They softened the chains into metaphors. And in doing so, they murdered memory. Children were told that the Civil War was about tariffs. That Reconstruction failed because freedmen couldn't govern. That the South had a unique way of life. Unique. Not brutal. Not inhumane. Not built on black backs and broken bodies. Just unique. Some students knew something was wrong. They heard the truth at home, or in whispers, or on the internet. But others didn't. They grew up learning that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man who fought for his state. That the Union had its flaws too. That racism was long ago. And that slavery was just one issue. They recited these half-truths on tests. They earned A's. They graduated. And they voted. This was the strategy. Forget the war ever ended. Forget it was ever fought for freedom. Recast it as a noble disagreement between brothers. Let the Confederacy survive not in flags, but in curriculum. Let it breathe through textbooks. Let it hide inside PowerPoints. Let it thrive in silence. There were teachers who resisted, who taught anyway, who brought in primary sources, slave narratives, court records, runaway ads. They spoke names that textbooks had buried. They showed students the cost of history. Some were reprimanded. Others lost their jobs. One teacher in Missouri was suspended for using Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing. Another in Texas was told to offer opposing views when discussing the Holocaust. This wasn't education. It was control. And behind that control was fear. Fear that if students truly learned what America had been, they would question what it still is. Fear that the war, if fully taught, would reveal it was never truly won. Fear that the ghosts of Gettysburg and Selma and Tulsa and Charleston would speak too loudly through the pages. So instead, they locked the pages away. They passed bills in over 36 states restricting how race and history could be taught. They called it parental rights. But the children were the ones being silenced. And the truth, the real, raw, bloody truth, was being suffocated in fluorescent-lit classrooms across the country. Every banned book, every censored lesson, every child told not to ask that. It was another monument to the Confederacy. Invisible, but no less permanent. And still the question lingered in the air. Who gets to define the Civil War? Is it the generals with their marble statues? Is it the politicians with their culture wars? Or is it the children, asking with trembling hands, why their ancestors were once considered property? The war for the soul of America didn't end in 1865. It just found a desk, a red pen, and a curriculum standard. And it began again. The flag fluttered in the wind, red and blue and white, but not the stars and stripes. It was the other one, the one draped over the bodies of dead Confederates, the one stitched together from defiance and blood and fantasy, the one that had no country but still refused to die. It waved from the back of a Ford pickup as it roared through a Walmart parking lot in Alabama, exhaust coughing, tailgate rattling. It wasn't a special day. It wasn't a protest. It was just Tuesday. The flag wasn't there to remember anything. It was there to remind. Inside the store, a child stared at it from behind the glass doors. She didn't know what it meant, not fully. She only knew her grandfather had said, "That's about pride, not hate." But her stomach tightened anyway. The wind caught it again, snapping louder this time, and the shadow of the past swept across the pavement like a ghost riding shotgun. They say it's history. They call it heritage. They wrap it around their necks at NASCAR races like it's armor, as if cheering for speed and smoke and gasoline makes them part of something older than speed itself. Until 2020, that flag was as common as beer cans in the stands. Bubba Wallace, the only black driver in the Cup Series, said it felt like walking into a war every time he stepped on the track. And then, after the murder of George Floyd, something shifted. Wallace spoke. NASCAR banned the flag. For a moment, the air changed. But bans are not exorcisms. Outside the stadiums, the flag still flew, on towels, on shirts, on the backs of lawn chairs. It had been sewn into the fabric of Southern identity so tightly that pulling the thread risked unraveling everything else. They said it wasn't political. They said it wasn't racist. They said it was about the South. But the South was never just sweet tea and porch swings. The South was also shackles and scars, and the flag remembered both, though only one part was ever celebrated. In the 1980s, America laughed as two cousins in tight jeans drove a bright orange Dodge Charger across county lines, the horn blaring Dixie, the flag painted proud across the roof. The Dukes of Hazzard ran for 7 seasons. It aired in syndication for decades. It made that flag seem like a joke, like a harmless relic from a make-believe time. But relics don't smile. Relics don't fly from churches burned to the ground. Relics don't show up at lynchings. That car, named the General Lee, wasn't just a muscle machine. It was a moving monument, barreling across screens into the minds of millions, turning a symbol of secession into a punchline. Kids bought the toys. Grown men bought the replicas. Whole families took photos with it at county fairs. And no one asked what that roof really meant. Not until Black Lives Matter. Not until blood soaked into asphalt again. Not until someone said, "That's not nostalgia. That's a warning." Country music sang it sweet for decades. Flags on guitars. Flags and lyrics. Flags behind stages as stars sang about pride and farms and boots in red clay. Hank Williams Jr. wore it like a second skin. Charlie Daniels told the devil to go back to Georgia with it flapping behind him. It wasn't called hate. It was called home. And if you questioned it, you were the problem. You were erasing history. You were too sensitive. You didn't understand Southern culture. But the flag wasn't misunderstood. It was mythologized, weaponized, resurrected. It never died after 1865. It just changed uniforms. They put it on t-shirts that read heritage, not hate. They stuck that phrase on bumper stickers and belt buckles like it explained everything. But heritage of what? Of Fort Sumter? Of Bull Run? Of Andersonville, where Union prisoners starved behind fences? Of black bodies picking cotton under shotguns? Of Jefferson Davis dreaming of a slave empire stretching to the Pacific? What part of that heritage didn't come soaked in violence? They said the flag was about ancestors who fought bravely. But bravery in service of bondage is not honor. It's tragedy. They said, my granddaddy didn't own slaves. But someone did. Millions did. And the system he fought for only existed to protect their power. They said, you're erasing our story. But the story was never erased. It was rewritten. And the edits began the moment the Confederacy fell. By the early 20th century, the lost cause had become holy. Textbooks declared slavery a side issue. Statues went up, not during the war, but during Jim Crow. And the flag, banished after Appomattox, was raised again during the civil rights movement like a curse hurled from the past into the present. In 1948, it became the banner of the Dixiecrats, those segregationists who left the Democratic Party rather than share a ballot with Black Americans. In 1962, South Carolina hoisted it above the State House as a statement against desegregation. In 2015, after 9 Black parishioners were murdered in their Charleston church by a white supremacist waving that very flag, debates flared again. The flag was removed from some places, but in too many others, it was defended louder than ever. Because it wasn't just a symbol. It was a mask. It was a way to say, the war's not over. It was denial dressed as pride. It was defiance disguised as memory. And it was always there, silent but screaming. On hats in grocery stores. On back windows in suburbia. In small towns where statues of Stonewall Jackson still cast long shadows at dusk. It moved through the culture like a virus without a cure. And every time someone said, it's not about race, a noose tightened around the truth. The Confederate flag never needed a battlefield. It had TV screens. It had airwaves. It had country songs and car decals. It had fathers teaching sons what to defend and why. And it had silence, the most powerful accomplice of all. Because the flag doesn't have to wave to hurt. It only has to exist. The ink never dried. January 16, 1865. General William Tecumseh Sherman signed Special Field Orders No. 15 on the scorched earth of the Georgia coast. 400,000 acres, seized from Confederate planters, were to be divided among the freedmen. 40 acres per family. A mule from the Army's surplus. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a slogan. It was real. It was written. And then it was stolen. Not in the darkness. Not with force. But with paper and politics. Andrew Johnson reversed it all before the year was out. White men came back with deeds in their hands and rage in their eyes. They took the land back. Land the freed had already begun to farm, to settle, to believe in. Black families were dragged off soil that had once held their sweat and their blood and their unborn futures. The plows stopped. The roots died. The promise turned to smoke. 160 years later, the smoke still hangs in the air. It chokes the breath of children growing up in neighborhoods built from absence. It thickens in the lungs of men denied loans, denied housing, denied legacy. It lingers behind wages that never catch up, schools that always fall behind, zip codes that seem cursed before a baby is even born. The land was the chance to be free not just in name, but in structure. To own, to build, to stand on something that could not be taken. And that chance was crushed beneath the heel of a nation that blinked when it mattered most. No restitution ever came. No compensation. No apology backed by action. Just a silence that got louder every decade. In 1969, Coretta Scott King stood at a press conference in Washington, D.C., holding a paper check for $500,000, money donated by individuals, not government, to a fund her husband had once called for. She said plainly, "This money is not a gift. It is payment on a debt." But the nation turned away. Some said it was too late. Some said it was too complex. Some said, "My family never owned slaves." As if racism needed ownership to reproduce. As if injustice had a ledger you could close. As if 1865 bled cleanly into 2025. Reparations is not about guilt. It is about repair. It is about walking into the vault of America's foundation and staring down what was taken and what was never repaid. Not just the land, the hours, the limbs, the languages, the mothers, the songs, The childhoods ground into dust beneath cotton fields and sugar cane and tobacco leaves. Generations born into theft. And still, the argument returns, again and again, like a fever that won't break. In 1989, Congressman John Conyers introduced a bill to study reparations. H.R. 40. He reintroduced it every year until his retirement. It never passed. 30 years of silence, broken only by outrage when cameras happened to catch the pain. In 2021, the bill finally made it out of committee, but nothing followed. Talk, hesitation, deflection. They said it's too hard to trace, too hard to calculate, too divisive, as if redlining wasn't documented, as if Jim Crow didn't write its own instruction manual, as if highways weren't deliberately built to split black communities, as if banks didn't discriminate in plain sight, as if the GI Bill wasn't written with asterisks for black veterans, as if reparations had not already been paid to Japanese Americans interned during World War II, to Jewish Holocaust survivors, to families of 9/11 victims. It can be done. It has been done, just not for the people who built the country brick by brick while wearing chains. And still, they fight for it. At city councils, in courtrooms, through commissions and panels. In 2020, Evanston, Illinois approved the nation's first municipal reparations program, offering black residents housing grants funded by marijuana tax revenue. In 2023, California's Reparations Task Force proposed over $1 million in potential compensation per eligible black resident. Some laughed, some raged, some called it theft in reverse. But the numbers weren't fiction. They were history with a price tag. And the price was staggering, because the crime had been that vast. And yet, money alone is not enough. What was lost can't all be counted in dollars. Try measuring the weight of a family name that never made it past the auction block. Try calculating the cost of dreams never dreamt. Try summing up the fear passed down through lullabies, the trauma pressed into smiles at job interviews, the constant battle to simply be treated as human. You can't, but that doesn't make the debt vanish. It just makes it heavier. Structural inequality didn't appear out of nowhere. It didn't creep in while no one was watching. It was designed. From the Freedmen's Bureau being gutted, to convict leasing filling the void of slavery with prison labor, to schools funded by property taxes in communities that never got property, the system didn't forget. It remembered what it was built for. It remembered who it was meant to exclude. The aftershocks of that theft ripple through every street with cracked sidewalks, every ER where black mothers die at higher rates, every arrest made for things white kids get warnings for, every job interview where a name triggers a pause. This isn't about slavery alone. This is about what came after, and after, and after. Every generation waiting for the promise to come true. 40 acres and a mule. They repeat the phrase now like folklore, like something too old to matter. But it mattered then. It matters now. Because that land would have been a beginning. Not wealth, but stability. Not luxury, but freedom. Not payback, but possibility. And instead, nothing. Not just once, but again and again and again. A promise broken is one thing. A broken promise inherited is another. Now, centuries later, the children of the unpaid walk with shadows beneath their feet. They try to plant roots in soil that was salted by design. And still, they rise, build businesses, write novels, lead movements, push through the weight of it all with calloused hands and open hearts. But justice is not what they've earned. It's what they are owed. The question is not whether the debt exists. The question is whether this country has the courage to pay it. The man stood alone in the dark on the shoulder of a Texas highway just outside Lubbock. The moon carved shadows across his rifle. Not military issue. Civilian bought. Legal. Polished. Loaded. He wasn't hunting deer. He was waiting for a signal. One that hadn't yet come, but one he swore would. It's not if, he muttered. It's when. His breath steamed in the cold air. The stars above him were silent, but his radio crackled with static and code. Frequencies filled with rumors. Threats. Instructions. That silence wasn't peace. It was waiting. In every corner of America, someone else waits just like him. Tense. Angry. Armed. The air is charged now. Different than before. People feel it in their bones. Not the loud kind of rage, but the slow burn that curls around your ribs and never lets go. A neighbor's yard sign becomes a challenge. A bumper sticker feels like a warning. Church sermons end with murmurs about tyranny. School board meetings explode into screaming matches over flags, books, vaccines, race. And then there are the maps. Maps passed around online in militia forums, in encrypted group chats, in patriot newsletters. Maps of secession lines, red counties, blue cities, battle zones. This is not a fantasy. This is how people are thinking, how they are preparing. In Texas, a petition to secede gained over 400,000 signatures in 2021. The Texas nationalist movement called it Texit. They hold rallies. They speak openly about independence. They talk about nullifying federal law, about restoring a republic they believe was stolen. In 2023, lawmakers introduced a bill to allow Texans to vote on leaving the United States. And in California, it's not all that different, just from the opposite edge of the spectrum. The Yes California campaign wants to break away too. Their slogan, California is a nation, not a state. To the east, some laugh. To the west, others cheer. Neither side realizes the edge they are walking. This is the United States. But more and more, it feels like United is only printed on the money. There are lawmakers who wear body armor beneath their suits. Congresspeople afraid of their colleagues. Armed protesters enter state capitals. In 2020, in Lansing, Michigan, dozens of men stormed the Capitol building in broad daylight. Bulletproof vests, rifles, camo. Police didn't fire a single shot. They let them scream in the Senate gallery. A practice run, some said. A warning, others whispered. The next year, on January 6th, it wasn't just a warning. It was the Capitol itself. Broken glass, Confederate flags, pipe bombs, police officers beaten, elected officials hiding under desks. It happened. Not in theory, not in fiction. In the seat of American power. A man wore a sweatshirt that read Camp Auschwitz. Another carried plastic cuffs. The line cracked that day, and it's never been mended. More than 1,000 were charged, but thousands more watched and felt something like pride. The talk hasn't stopped. It's changed form, shifted into militias, podcasts, state resolutions, the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo Bois. These aren't just names on a watch list. They're people who live next door, who train in woods, who practice tactical formations and speak about tyranny in the same breath as freedom. They don't trust the government. They don't trust the media. They don't trust democracy, at least not when they lose. They see the nation as already broken. The danger isn't a traditional war. It won't start with cannons or state armies. It won't have uniforms or parades. It will come like a storm. Fast in some places, slow in others. A school shooting becomes a political firestorm. A governor refuses to certify election results. A sheriff in Idaho says he won't enforce federal law. Then a shooting, one fueled by ideology, by hate. Then a courthouse burns. Then a standoff in a rural town. People won't call it war at first. But blood doesn't lie. And blood has already started to fall. The FBI reported a 350% rise in militia activity since 2018. Hate crimes, especially racially motivated ones, are on a sharp incline. Armed groups gather at drag shows. They patrol protests. They surveil polling stations. They call themselves protectors. But what they're really protecting is the myth of control. The idea that this country belongs to one kind of American, and that if they can't have it, no one will. This isn't paranoia. It's pattern. In 1861, secession didn't begin with cannon fire. It began with speeches, with meetings, with defiance masked as legality. South Carolina left the Union not because it was forced, but because it chose to. The documents they left behind make it plain. It was about slavery, white supremacy, control. Today's threats come dressed in different language, states' rights, voter fraud, freedom, but the engine beneath is the same. Power. Fear. The belief that if the system doesn't serve you, it must be dismantled. The Civil War never really ended. It just changed its uniform. Now it wears red hats, or tactical gear, or business suits. It posts online. It files lawsuits. It builds bunkers. It stands on overpasses with assault rifles. It smirks on talk radio and dares the other side to make a move. The most dangerous part? No one believes it can happen until it already is. People call it hyperbole. They say the country's too modern, too rich, too stable. But history doesn't care how comfortable you are. Rome fell. Yugoslavia tore itself to pieces. Rwanda lit the match in broad daylight. Civil wars begin when neighbors stop seeing each other as people, when they start seeing threats, when elections become battles, when compromise becomes betrayal, when violence starts to feel like the only language left. In America, some families no longer speak at Thanksgiving. In some counties, teachers are threatened for teaching facts. In some states, people carry guns into grocery stores like shields. This isn't peace. It's pressure. And pressure cracks. One spark, a contested election, a shooting, a governor defying the court, and the country could splinter. Not in every place, but in enough places to tear the idea of a union beyond repair. The gunman outside Lubbock adjusts his cap. He checks his phone. He scrolls through encrypted messages, each one more certain than the last. Be ready. 1776 all over again. No retreat. He isn't alone. Not even close. The boy stared at the statue like it was alive. Richmond, Virginia. The base was stained with red paint, but the eyes of Robert E. Lee still looked out across Monument Avenue with a cold, unbending silence. Behind the boy, his father whispered a name under his breath. Not the name of the general, but the name of someone they'd lost. Not in 1865, not in Gettysburg, but in a Walmart parking lot in 2020, where a man wearing a Confederate flag on his shirt shot his cousin in broad daylight after an argument about patriotism. The war is over, they say, but the monuments still stand. The flags still wave, and the graves keep filling. The Civil War never burned out. It just went underground. It moved into textbooks, into courthouse steps, into ballots and backroom meetings. It sank into the foundations of the schools, the laws, the streets. It wrapped itself around the very idea of what it means to be American, then whispered into the ear of every child. Choose a side. Because this country never really agreed on what happened. Who won? Who lost? What justice meant? What freedom cost? In 1865, the Confederacy surrendered, but it didn't vanish. It was absorbed, folded into the bloodstream of the nation. Its soldiers weren't tried for treason. Its leaders weren't exiled. Its generals were honored. And its story, twisted and varnished, became part of the myth. The lost cause. A noble fight, they said. A war over state rights, they claimed. As if 600,000 bodies had collapsed over a misunderstanding. As if slavery had been a footnote. But it wasn't a footnote. It was the whole damn page. And yet, a century later, the South flew its flag again, not in mourning, but in defiance. 1956. Georgia placed the Confederate emblem on its state flag at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. A warning, a reminder, a statement. It wasn't about heritage. It was about control. The message rang out loud. You may have ended slavery, but you haven't ended us. That's how you lose a war and keep fighting. In every fiber of the nation, the conflict remains. Not just in symbols, but in systems. Where schools in black neighborhoods crumble. Where roads split cities by race. Where hospitals turn away mothers in labor. Where redlining still pulses beneath real estate contracts. Where prison beds are calculated based on third-grade reading scores. This is not the aftermath of a war. This is the war. This is the war continuing in codes and ballots, in bullets and budgets, in silence. Ask someone in Alabama what the war meant. Ask someone in Oakland. Ask in Tulsa. Ask in Charleston. You'll get a different answer each time, and each one will be true in its own way, and yet none of them complete. Because the war carved this country down its center, not like a scar, but like a fault line. And fault lines shift. One tremor, and everything shakes again. National identity. There isn't one. There are shards. North, south, urban, rural, white, black, progressive, traditional, each pulling away from the other, eyes narrowed, fists clenched. Every election feels like a siege. Every speech like a call to arms. The country doesn't speak in one voice anymore. And how could it? The Union won the war, but lost the peace. Reconstruction was supposed to be a beginning, but it was sabotaged. The Freedmen's Bureau was underfunded. Black politicians were driven out with terror and lynch mobs. Federal troops left the South in 1877, and the night returned. Jim Crow rose from the ashes like a vulture. Freed people were chained again, this time by different means. Sharecropping, vagrancy laws, poll taxes, literacy tests. 40 acres and a mule became a broken promise. A joke, a curse passed down. Tell a people they are free, then deny them land, protection, and dignity, and you do not end a war. You prolong it. You curse it into the future. So what does it mean to win a civil war if the losing side gets to write the textbooks? What does it mean to win if monuments to traitors rise higher than monuments to heroes? What does it mean to win if 160 years later, you still have to explain why Black Lives Matter? It means there was no peace. Not really. Just a pause between rounds. And now, some want to fire again. Not just with guns, but with laws, with court rulings, with school boards banning facts, with states redrawing maps like battlefield trenches. They say it's about tradition, about values, about protecting children. But beneath it is the same old lie, that only one kind of American gets to define the country, and the rest are intruders. The rest are lucky to be tolerated. That's the shadow we live under. Not a ghost story, not a metaphor. A shadow so real you can trace its edge across time. From Fort Sumter to Selma, from Appomattox to Charlottesville, from the Emancipation Proclamation to George Floyd's final breath on a Minneapolis street. Every era has its moment of reckoning. But America refuses to reckon. It wants to forget. It wants the war to be in black and white, grainy photos and brass buttons. A time long gone, but the wounds are still fresh. The trauma is still generational. You can't pave over graves and call it healing. You can't ignore a battlefield just because grass has grown over it. In Mississippi, the state flag bore the Confederate cross until 2020. In Tennessee, Nathan Bedford Forrest's bust stood proudly in the state capitol until 2021. Forrest, the man who founded the Ku Klux Klan. In Alabama, counties still honor Confederate Memorial Day. What country does this? What nation wins a war and then honors its enemies? Only one that never really knew who it was to begin with. The Civil War wasn't just about geography. It was about the soul of the country. And the soul has never been whole. The boy in Richmond stared at that statue a little longer. His father tugged at his arm. They turned and walked away. But the statue stayed, watching, waiting, not just for them, but for the next question, the next march, the next conflict, the next blood spilled in the name of a nation still trying to decide what kind of war it's willing to remember and what kind it's doomed to repeat.